The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I am Al Warren. Mr. Mike Poutine Brown is co-hosting today.
Oh boy, I'm back.
You're back
with a vengeance. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Is that good or bad?
I don't know. It sounds terrible, actually.
Oh. Well, and you're still doing the other show, the one about
I do supernatural circumstances every 2 weeks and Dark Poutine every week, and I'm writing another book about things spooky, so it should be an interesting next couple of years for me. Hopefully I'll have a break maybe at some point.
Oh, what would you do with a break anyway?
Right.
Yeah, you just think about other things you want to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's an addiction. You can't get over it.
It really is.
You have to get over it. Well, today, so we kind of cover both in a sense. You're a perfect man for the job because...
Well, I don't know about perfect, but
You're always perfect. I mean,
yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
So we've got the authors of a couple of books here that are both very interesting, and it's The Science of Serial Killers and, of course, The Science of Witchcraft. And the authors are Meg Hafdahl and Kelly Florence. So thank you for being here, ladies.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
How did the two of you get together and decide you're going to write these types of books? Like, what was the initiation? What happened here? And let's start with Meg first.
Sure. So, we have been best friends for 22 years. So we, naturally sort of work well together. And we both sort of grew up as horror lovers, and we didn't really have that friend that, loved horror. So when we met, we were like, oh my gosh, somebody who wants to watch horror movies and talk about them. And so I started my career writing horror fiction, and Kelly is a professor. And so we kind of combined the things that we're good at, like research and, watching and discussing horror films and all of those things. And it just made sense after we started a podcast called Horror Rewind. It made sense to actually start writing books about the things that we love.
Yes, we found that every week on our podcast, we were talking about the real science, history, culture, lore, medical conditions, psychology that these movies and TV shows were based on. And we wanted to share it with the world and do more research and interview all types of people that could give us that lens into the horror world through a science focus.
Yeah, it's interesting. How long does it take you to put one of these books together?
So we've released 5 books since 2019. So we've been writing one every 6 months pretty much. We've been busy. So
now on The Science of Serial Killers, when you get into that, how do you decide which killers you're going to talk about or which ones you're going to analyze?
Yeah. Well, for instance, for serial killers, we start out with, and we do this with most of our books, we start out with a film we knew that we had to do or people on. So like, for instance, we made sure we talk about, Jeffrey Dahmer, we talk about Ted Bundy. And again, we're starting through that sort of filmic lens. But then there were ones that, for instance, Lizzie Borden is technically not a serial killer, but I'm absolutely fascinated with that case. So I pushed for that. So a lot of times it can be like, okay, I want to do something that like I really find interesting. We came across films too, like, for instance, we do a chapter on Rope, the awesome Alfred Hitchcock movie, and that is based on Leopold and Loeb, the two killers, who again technically are not serial killers, but it's such a great film to start with, and the sort of concepts that these two men believed, and how that's depicted in the film, and then the research that went into it. Sometimes you start with a film, sometimes you start with a serial killer.
In that particular one, I mean, that was pretty far off from from Leopold and Loeb. That wasn't really a
Rope. Yeah.
Yeah. That was kind of it was a concept of people that wanted to do the perfect murder, but there was a huge amount of other things going on between those two.
Oh, you've stepped into a nest of bees here.
Well, yeah, I mean, they both in the film, they touch on that there these two men who are not Leopold Loeb, but who are similar. They're in the sense that they're privileged white men who are trying to do the perfect murder under the nose of police. They touch on this sort of love of Nietzsche and sort of like this misreading of what Nietzsche was trying to say, which I think they do a great job of showing how they fumbled that in the Leopold and Loeb case.
Yeah, it was an interesting case. I actually did a book on that.
Some of the serial killers that you cover are not necessarily ones that people think about when they think about a killer. One would be Amy Archer Gilligan from the Arsenic and Old Lace, the inspiration for Arsenic and Old Lace. Were there killers that you wanted to bring to people's attention more than others, maybe? Obviously, you talk about Ted Bundy, you talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, but were there sort of pet cases that you guys were into and you really wanted to do for the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something important to us was, like Meg said, finding those cases or those movies that maybe people haven't heard of. Lake Bodom, for example, is a chapter, and it's about an unsolved case from the 60s where 4 teenagers went out camping and they were murdered, and they've never caught who did it. And so looking through that lens and talking to the filmmaker about how, when you think of Finland, you don't think serial killers, but they really have this really big case that people still think about. Also, we wanted to draw attention to the Highway of Tears and the concept of less dead, those that, the police don't necessarily know are missing, whether it be Indigenous women in that case or sex workers. So just finding to shine light on the cases that might be overlooked.
Yeah, you're speaking my language here with that one. I cover mostly Canadian true crime, and I'm here in British Columbia. So obviously the Highway of Tears is one of my pet cases. So I was happy to see you folks cover that. You cover a lot of ground in your books too. 30 stories in Science of Serial Killers, and your latest book, Science of Witchcraft, there's 23 different topics that you talk about?
Yeah, 23 different TV shows or movies that we started with, and then through that thread of research, we find just hundreds of topics and concepts to talk about and interview people about.
I was just going to say it's really important to us that like our books are fun and approachable, and we find that being able to sort of like touch on certain things, whether we're touching on H.H. Holmes or we're touching on Wizard of Oz, it's fun to sort of keep it brief. And if we get too down the rabbit hole of like, time travel, it could get really esoteric. So we like to keep it fun.
So for Science of Witchcraft, you start with the origins, and are you talking the origins of witchcraft and where the word witch comes from, that kind of thing? It's really fascinating. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, we do touch on that, and since we have written about witchcraft previously in our book, The Science of Monsters, we didn't want to repeat topics, but we talk about sort of how when you hear the word witch, what that conjures in our minds, and go through the fairy tales and the stories and TV shows and movies that really started some of these tropes for witchcraft movies.
I noticed a real backlash toward Hocus Pocus 2 all over online, and a lot of people saying that they shouldn't be talking about witchcraft to children with these types of movies. And I wonder, so what was your experience with witchcraft in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, that seems very extreme. But, Kelly and I are huge feminists, and we see witchcraft as a very empowering, it's not only in media, like in films, whether the witch is good or bad, but also in real life where, women are using, nature, to heal. And, they are, whether you believe in anything supernatural, the idea of witchcraft is very feminine, And it's very grounded in things that are often positive, like manifesting and things like that. So I think that, the idea that witchcraft is somehow something bad that you wouldn't want your children to know about, I think that's a pretty narrow view of it as a whole. And I think that, goes in line with some people not maybe fully understanding what witchcraft really is about, and maybe taking like bits and pieces from different media sources and thinking that is true.
When you say revealing the spellbinding science behind legends, lore, and all that, and you're talking about different powers in witchcraft, do you find that there's any, let's say, true science behind like spells and witchcraft things that are done?
Yeah, so in our chapter of Sleepy Hollow, we talked about how, in that story and in the movie version, witches are using things from nature to make potions and cast spells. And so we spoke to an indigenous ethnobotanist, and she was told us about how for generations it's been mainly women who were using nature, and this is science-based, for healing practices and, of course, medicine. And that even though, as soon as in the Industrial Revolution, when men started taking over more of the medical and science fields, women who were seen as healers, all of a sudden, well, they must be witches. And so it got that negative connotation. But this ethnobotanist was saying this has been passed down from generations, and it is science-based. And so even though it seems like it's magic, it's based in reality.
Oh, so do I have to worry about someone putting a spell on me?
Yeah.
I can't speak on that, but
well, is it going to work if they do? That's the question. Yeah. What is it you found out during your research on witchcraft that surprised you?
I'll take this one, Meg. I think for me, it was that Meg mentioned the word manifestation, and that sounds very out there. And you hear about people making vision boards or keeping manifestation journals, and you think initially like, oh, they're just trying to make something happen magically, and they're not doing anything for it. But what we found is that psychologically, just the practice of writing down your goals will actually help you work toward them, because it's the connection between your brain and that piece of paper and the repetition, and it'll get you into a routine to actually work toward those goals. So maybe you write down every morning that you're going to go for a walk, or you're writing down your career goals, and that will actually help you succeed in those goals. And that's what the real power of manifestation is. It's not, necessarily casting a spell and it'll magically appear.
So when someone takes home one of these books, let's say the witchcraft book, for instance, what do you hope that they get from the book? What is it that you want them to understand?
I think for me, I think Kelly's on the same page here. We both absolutely love horror. And we think that horror is a great way to learn, not only like empathy and storytelling and many great other things. But there is a science, in every horror film. There's something historical, scientific, and I use science as like a pretty broad term, whether it be sociological or feminist studies or biology or something to learn. And so we hope that people kind of get a love for our genre that we love, and also appreciate that you can learn through media, whether it be books, movies, or TV shows.
I think, too, that the thing that we try to do, as Meg said, we keep it fun and approachable, and inject some personal stories and things from our own lives, so that you get to know us, too, and that it feels like you're talking with friends and having a fun conversation, as opposed to reading a textbook.
So as far as different sections in the book, I'm looking at the one fairy tales right now, and witches have been featured throughout fairy tales and folklore forever, it seems. How do you think those inform the stories that are told today about witches in film, for example?
Something interesting that we've discovered is that a lot of modern retellings of fairy tales are actually showing the movie. They kind of turn it on its head and show it from the witch's perspective, or they're showing the backstory that created the witch, so to speak, and her motivations. And so it's finding out the backstory of the Wicked Witch of the West in the musical and book Wicked, and finding out actually, she has, maybe it doesn't excuse her behavior, but it explains it. Same with the Maleficent movies that Angelina Jolie starred in a few years ago. It's not just painting the witch as evil and bad. It's actually giving her more depth and complexity.
Back in the old days when they used to hang people for being a witch or burn them, do you think that they were real witches, or what's your thought on that? Or were they just outspoken women, or what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of that it's horrible, but there's this human compulsion to find out who the other is in the community and to separate them. And I think that that could be simply something, somebody who is homosexual, somebody who isn't into the religion that is the religion of the day. It could be a woman who doesn't want to have children. I mean, there were women who were called out to be witches just because they weren't married, or because they had more than one sexual partner, or, so it really comes down to, obviously, and it makes sense in the Puritan Salem sort of sense of it, because society was so strict and rigid in that time period, that anybody who sort of went outside of that was often called a witch. And, sometimes it was people getting into spiritualism, that there was sort of a rise of that later in the Victorian era, when people weren't necessarily executed for being a witch, but they were certainly exiled or not, brought into society, or they were judged because they were getting into spiritualism and things like that, and experimenting maybe with, Ouija boards, or with trying to talk to spirits and things like that. So I think ultimately it's about being an other, and that unfortunately is something that humans have done throughout history.
When I jump back to like the serial killer, you mentioned how about Jack the Ripper and Zodiac, some of the big famous unsolved cases. Do you think that there is some possibility that science or DNA will reveal some of these long-held unknown killers?
I think so. I think just, as we're researching that book, and now we're working on our next one with it, which is about Agatha Christie, we have found that science and investigative techniques have changed so much, obviously, with technology and DNA evidence. I think we might be able to uncover some of these long-held mysteries, and hopefully, get some victims, to rest in peace, to find their killers.
Yeah, literally while we were writing the serial killer book, the news came out with that they had deciphered something that the Zodiac had written, and this was, something that had been sitting there for 50, 60 years. Mm-hmm. And so we had to go back in the book because it was still the editing phase, and add that part in, which was really exciting to feel like, oh wow, this case that is so old, there's something new to say. So that was really cool. On the flip side, something like Jack the Ripper, I mean, I don't know. I feel like that case might be just too old to find the actual culprit and be 100% sure, but never say never.
Yeah, well, they were washing all the scene down, the crime scene, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's going to be a hard one to know whose DNA you found or anything, right?
Right.
I recently went to London, and I stayed in Whitechapel and went to the Jack the Ripper Museum, and I couldn't solve it.
Oh,
darn
you
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're fired.
Exactly.
Well, that's interesting. So now, was there anything exciting that you found out in doing the serial killer book? Was there something that you didn't know about one of these killers?
we've talked about this before, that this was probably the hardest book we ever had to write because it was 100% based in truth, and there were real victims. And so just some of the disturbing cases, like for me, the hardest chapter to write was about Israel Keyes.
Yeah.
And his victims and mythology. Sorry. It was so disturbing that we would have to take a step away and not watch serial killer movies or documentaries for a while because it was just so devastating.
Yeah, I've consumed true crime. I grew up watching, America's Most Wanted and all that with my mom, Unsolved Mysteries. And so I've always watched the documentaries and things, but actually after writing the book and the process of writing the book, I actually did have to take a break because I was like, wow, this is really bleak. And I think that Kelly and I had sort of challenged ourselves to really strip away any pretension of the killers being put on a pedestal. We really wanted to show that these aren't cool guys. It's not like when we write about, Jason or Freddy or Pennywise and it's kind of fun and they're cheeky and, this is reality, and these were awful people, and they weren't clever. They weren't smart. They weren't good looking. They're bad. And, so I think that challenge was really the big surprise of balancing that and making sure that we're doing what we need to do to feel like we are honoring victims and we're not glorifying the killers.
And the other thing, too, with researching all of these different serial killers and cases is we wanted to make sure, too, that we're not just labeling them as monsters. They were human beings, and it's important to not just dismiss them as like, well, that's them. And in order to hopefully prevent these types of crimes in the future, we have to recognize sort of where they came from, what their circumstances were, so that we can, try to prevent it in the future for others.
That's a hard thing to do, but right? Because you can take someone like Dahmer or any of these, Ted Bundy, and there's several other people that are in the same situation, so they might have the same awful lifestyle and people, because we don't really get a chance to study any of these serial killers. We don't really get a good chance to analyze them in person. So I think that's a hard thing to accomplish.
Yeah, we were just doing a presentation yesterday on our books, and someone asked about, are serial killers born or are they made? I think the true answer is that it's different for every single person, and that's really scary. We'd love to just be like, oh, this and this happens, and that is the perfect, storm. That person will become a serial killer, but it's just not that simple. So, that's what really scares me and keeps me up at night is, you can't predict it. I mean, the good news is we have fewer serial killers, operating right now, leaps in technology and stuff. It's a lot harder to be a serial killer nowadays. And that's good news. But yeah, it's kind of scary that there's not this like perfect formula that we can point to and say, okay, that person's going to be the next Ted Bundy.
Did you like some of the things like the new Dahmer series and stuff that's on Netflix? There's kind of a lot of backlash toward maybe some of the victims' families and the people surrounding it that have to deal with it. And there's also, I watched the first episode of that series, and they already changed what really happened. Like they had the neighbor living next door, which was the lady that didn't live there and complained. Like they sort of create history themselves to make it more exciting or thrilling and stuff like that. Do you think that's a good thing?
I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing for honoring victims and telling the truth of what happened. I realize why, Ryan Murphy has changed stories just for television and drama. But, so I can see it from both perspectives. It's a very disturbing series, and Evan Peters is an excellent actor, but it's hard to watch as an outsider, let alone I can't imagine being, a relative.
I feel like older cases, like when you're talking about sort of like I call them vintage murders, but like if you're talking about Lizzie Borden or even something like Ed Gein, which wasn't that far long ago, but certainly there aren't a lot of living people still, or certainly Jack the Ripper. I think it's a little easier to play around with the drama and the fictionalization of it. Dahmer still feels really fresh. For people, we live in the Midwest, so, that's still relatively fresh. And, it does concern me. I know, like, we, talked about the Charlize Theron movie, Monster, and, that also had a lot of backlash, because they felt that, the victims' families felt that she was being portrayed as with a lot of empathy. And so I don't know, that's a tough call, because I believe in sort of the point of filmmakers being able to do what they want, but they also have to be aware that, this affects real people. So I don't know, it's a tightrope to walk.
I think in that series they need to make it clear that it's not a documentary. It's not true. I think too many young people just think everything they see in it, they believe it. If you look at social media, you'll see people complaining about, well, why didn't the police do something with the neighbor and all that? Well, she didn't exist. But they don't know that, but they're taking it as if this is the story. And that's what I'm sort of getting at, that they, I understand why they change, like they do things to make it, more exciting and get more emotions running while people are watching it. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is they don't tell people clearly at the beginning that this is dramatized and that a lot of the events are created. Like this isn't a true to form story. It's just, other than you got Dahmer and he did kill these people, but a lot of the events in the series are not real. And I think that they need to establish that. Otherwise, you have a whole group of people believing it.
Yeah, for sure. Because people will believe, okay, this is the reality. And if you watch the Ted Bundy movie, that Zac Efron is in, and that's more from the perspective of his girlfriend. But if you don't get into the awful things that these people did, if you don't depict that truthfully, then people do get sort of a more, certainly fake, but a more favorable idea of who these people are.
And so what did you find the difference between female and male serial killers were?
Something that we had researched and wrote about previously played into this book as well, which is that oftentimes motivations for murder for women had to do with money and maybe an abusive situation or an inheritance. That's not always the case, but that was more prominent, whereas men often killed for power or control or sexual pleasure. And so that was a big difference that we found. What were the others?
Yeah, women tend to, and they this is heartless and cruel, of course, but they tend to kill to get further ahead as far as money or stature, things like that. While men, and I think that this is no shock. Men tend to kill more out of sexual pleasure, like Kelly said, but of course that's based in, feelings of power and control. There is actually quite a disparity on the reasons. And of course there are people who, aren't necessarily in that realm, like Jane Toppin, for example. She has a great quote about that she got, a sexual thrill from killing, but at the same time, she tended to kill for money.
So how did it affect either one of you at the end of writing either one of these books? When you come out of it, does it change the way you write now, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think after the witchcraft book, we felt empowered and understanding too that, our viewpoint is that being a witch or labeling yourself as a witch, a lot of times is just showing independence, showing that I can make my own decisions and I can set my own destiny and course for my life, and I don't have to be brought down by the patriarchy. So yeah, we definitely felt empowered.
How do people find the book? Or either book? And how do you guys have a website?
Yep. So you can find us. Both of us have our names: KellyFlorence.com and MegHafdahl.com, and then together our podcast is Horror Rewind, and so you can find us on all the social medias under our names and under HorrorRewind.com.
Fantastic. Are you guys? What's next for you? Science of the Pandemic, or?
No, yeah, Science of Agatha Christie is next, and we're almost done with that. It'll be out in 2023, nice. And it's been a nice pivot again. Fascinating look into all the crimes that Agatha Christie wrote about and the real science that she based them on.
Wow, sounds fantastic. Well, ladies, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for telling us about your new books. Again, we're talking about the science of serial killers and the science of witchcraft. So thank you, Meg and Kelly.
Thank you so much for having us.
So much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.